Chapter 4 Pizza Money. An early and apparent difference between the two Johns' internal human engines was the way they processed time. It was the kind of difference that made them perfect complements, and the kind that could cause irreparable conflict. Carmack was of the moment. His ruling force was focus. Time existed for him not in some promising future or sentimental past, but in the present condition. The intricate web of problems and solutions, imagination and code. He kept nothing from the past. No pictures, no records, no games, no computer disks. He didn't even save copies of his first games, Wraith and Shadowforge. There was no yearbook to remind him of his time at school, no magazine copies of his early publications. He kept nothing but what he needed at the time. His bedroom consisted of a lamp, a pillow, a blanket, and a stack of books. There was no mattress. All he brought with him from home was a cat named Mitzi, a gift from his stepfamily, with a mean streak and a reckless bladder. Romero, by contrast, was immersed in all moments, past, future, and present. He was an equal opportunity enthusiast, as passionate about the present as about the time gone and the time yet to come. He didn't just dream, he pursued, hoarding everything from the past, immersing himself in the dynamism of the moment, and charting out the plans for what was to come. He remembered every date, every name, every game. To preserve the past, he kept letters, magazines, discs, Burger King pay stubs, pictures, games, receipts. To inflate the present, he pumped up any opportunity for fun, telling a better joke, a funnier story, making a crazier face. Yet he wasn't manic. He knew how to focus. When he was on, loving everything, everybody. But when he was off, cold, distant, short. Tom Hall came up with a nickname for the behavior. In computers, information is represented in bits. A bit can either be on or off. Tom called Romero's mood swings the bit flip. The fateful morning of September 20th, 1990, Romero's bit flipped right on. It was a date he seared into his memory, and Carmack would soon forget. But it was equally important to both. Carmack had used his laser focus to solve an immediate challenge: how to get a PC game to scroll. Romero used Carmack's solution, Dangerous Dave and copyright infringement, to envision what would come. Carmack had created a palette that Romero used to paint the future. And the future, it became clear, had nothing to do with soft disk. After seeing Carmack, Romero couldn't contain his excitement. He darted around the office, pulling others to come in and check out the game. "Oh my God, look at this!" he said as a couple of employees watched the demo play. "Is that the fucking coolest thing on the planet, or what?" "Oh," one of the guys replied lethargically. "That's pretty neat." "That's pretty neat?" Romero responded. "Wait a minute. This is like the fucking coolest thing ever. Don't you understand?" The guy shrugged and said, "Whatever," then returned to their offices. "Fucking idiots," Romero declared. By the time everyone else had arrived, he was on the verge of exploding. Tom, Jay, Lane, and Adrian were all in the Gamer's Edge office, watching amusedly as Romero held court, playing the demo. "Oh my God," Romero said. "This is the fucking coolest thing ever. We are fucking gone. We have to do this. We have got to start our own company and get out of here with this. Because Softdisk ain't doing anything with it. No one's going to see this. We need to do this on our own. This is too big to waste on this company." Jay was hanging out in the doorway, his fingertips gripping the frame. "Eh? Come on," he said, chortling. He said Romero's giddiness before. It was an enthusiasm that bordered on hyperbole. Romero got this excited when he won a round of Pac-Man. He was a human exclamation point. Romero froze, hands in the air. "Dude," he said gravely, "I'm totally serious." Jay stepped in and shut the door behind him. Romero explained his rationale. First off, this was a robust 16-color game. Softdisk was interested in only doing 4-color games that appealed to the lowest common denominator of users. Second, this was essentially the Nintendo-style game made for a PC, something on par with the best-selling console title in the world, Mario. That meant the game was sure to sell because everyone was getting a PC, and naturally, everyone would want a fun video game to play. It was perfect. They had already had an ideal team. Carmack, the graphics guru and resident whiz kid. Romero, the multi-talented programmer and company cheerleader. Adrian, the artist and dark visionary. And Tom, game designer and comic book surrealist. Although Romero was still displeased with Lane, he was willing to give him one more chance to pull through. Regardless, the core chemistry was potent. Carmack's steadfastness balanced Romero's effusive passion. Adrian's grisly taste countered Tom's cartoon comedy. All they needed was someone to do the business side, handle the finances, balance the books, manage the team. Everyone looked to Jay. "Dude, you've got to be part of this too." Jay gave them his biggest bartender smile and agreed. "Here's what I think we should do," he said. "This needs to be taken right to the top of Nintendo. Now. If they could ever get a deal to do a PC port of Super Mario Bros. 3, they could be in business. Serious business." They decided to take the weekend to make a complete demo of the game, with a few added levels, as well as the inclusion of the Mario character, and Jay would send it off. There was only one problem, but it was sizable. If they were going to moonlight this game, they didn't want Softdisk to know. That meant they couldn't do it in the office. They would have to work on it at home. Thing was, they didn't have computers they needed to get the job done. The 5 of them sat quietly in the Gamer's Edge office, pondering the problem as Dangerous Dave looped across the screen. Carmack and Romero had been both without the computers they wanted earlier in life, so this wouldn't be the first time they came up with a way to get them. The cars backed up to the Softdisk office, trunks open, waiting in the night. It was late Friday night, long after all the other employees had returned home to their families and television sets. No one would use the PCs from the office on Saturday and Sunday, so they might as well make use of them, the gamers figured. They weren't stealing the computers, they were borrowing them. After loading Softdisk computers in their cars, Romero, Jay, Carmack, Tom, and Lane caravanned out of town. They drove away from the rundown buildings, down the highway, until the scenery began to change to low-hanging trees and swamps. Late-night fishermen lined a bridge with their lines in the purple-black murk. A bridge led them to South Lakeshore Drive, the border of Shreveport's main recreational front and main water supply, Cross Lake. Carmack, Lane, Jay, and an Apple II programmer at Softdisk named Jason Blokleviak had scored an enviable coupe not long before when they found a 4-bedroom house for rent right along these shores. Jay had bought a cheap boat, which they docked there and used for frequent outings of kneeboarding and skiing. In the large backyard was a swimming pool and barbecue, with which Jay, a cooking enthusiast, grilled up Flintstonian slabs of ribs. The house itself had plenty of windows looking out on the scene, a large living room, even a big tiled bathroom with a deep earth-stone tiled jacuzzi tub. Jay had installed a beer keg in the fridge. It was a perfect place to make games. Over the weekend, while making the Super Mario demo, the gamers put the house to the ultimate test. They hooked 2 of the Softdisk computers up on a large table that Carmack had been using to hold the all-night Dungeons & Dragons sessions with the guys. Tom did all the graphics, and Lane animated the familiar little turtle. Earlier, they had videotaped the entire gameplay of Super Mario Bros. 3 to capture all the elements. Tom kept running back and forth pressing pause on the VCR so he could copy the scenes. Over those 72 hours, they fell into crunch mode. No one slept. They consumed huge quantities of caffeinated soda. Pizza deliveries came repeatedly. Jay worked the grill, churning out a steam of burgers and hot dogs, which often went uneaten. They got the game down to a T. Mario's squat little walk, the way he bopped the animated tiles, sending out the coins, the way he leapt on the turtles and kicked their shells, the clouds, the Venus flytraps, the pipes, the smooth scrolling. By the time they finished, the game was virtually identical to the best-selling hit in the world. The only noticeable difference was the title screen, which, under Nintendo copyright, credited the makers, a company name the guys borrowed from Romero and Lane. Ideas from the deep. With the game done, Jay put together a letter explaining who they were and how they wanted Nintendo to take an unprecedented step of licensing Super Mario for the PC. Hopes high, the boys taped up the box and sent it on its way to Nintendo. When the response came back a few weeks later, it was short and sweet. "Nice work," the company said, but Nintendo had no interest in pursuing the PC market. It was happy where it was as the world leader in consoles. It was a disappointment for the group, especially following the elation of the Lake House programming marathon. But it was not the end by any means. There had to be someone out there who would appreciate their accomplishment. Romero knew just the guy. Not long before, Romero had received his very first fan letter while working at Softdisk. It was typewritten and cordial. "Dear John," it read, "loved your game. Just wanted to let you know that it was a great game, and I think you were very talented. Have you played The Greatest Pyramid? It is almost the same as your game. I was wondering if you made that game too, or if you were inspired by it. I can send you a copy if you want. Although, what's your high score for your game? Have you been programming long? And what language did you use? I am thinking about writing a game, and any tips you have would be helpful. Thanks from a big fan. Sincerely, Brian Mueller." Romero, the pack rat, had immediately taped the letter up on his wall and showed it off to Carmack, Tom, Lane, and Adrian. A couple weeks later, he got another fan letter, handwritten and a bit more urgent. "Dear John," it read, "I loved your game. It is better than any other pyramid-type game that was in Big Blue Disc a few issues ago. I finished the game after staying up until 2 a.m. last night. Great fun. What's your best score in the game? Is there a secret key that advances to the next level automatically? Do you know of any similar games? Please call me collect if you want, or please write. Thanks a million. Scott Mullier. P.S. I think I found a minor bug in the game." "Wow," Romero beamed. "Another fan." He taped the list's letter up on the wall next to the other one, and again bragged to Carmack and Adrian, who rolled their eyes. Soon after, Romero was flipping through PC Games magazine when he came to a brief article about Scott Miller, a 29-year-old programmer who was having great success distributing his own games. Intrigued, Romero read to the bottom of the article where it listed Scott's address: 4206 Mayflower Drive, Garland, Texas, 75043. He paused. Garland, Texas? Garland, Texas. Who did he know in Garland, Texas, on Mayflower Drive? He set down the magazine and looked up on his wall. The fan letters! By now he had accumulated several of them, and to his amazement, though they were all signed by different names, each and every one of them had the same return address: Mayflower Drive, Garland. Romero was pissed. Here he was showing off to the other guys about all his supposed fans, when in fact, it was just some loser fucking with his mind. Who the fuck does Scott Miller think he is? Romero whipped around to his keyboard and banged out a letter in fury. Scott, you, sir, have serious psychological problems. What's the deal with the 15 million odd names you've been writing under to reach me? Huh? Brian Mullier? Brian Allen? Brian Moeller? How old are you really? 15? Romero fumed for a couple pages, then left the letter on his desk. The next day, he came back, cooled off, and wrote another note. Dear Mr. Miller, he typed, I have taken a considerable amount of time to reply to your last letter. The reason is because I was infuriated when I found out that you had written to me previously about 3 to 4 other times, all under different names, and I didn't know what was going on. My previous reply is a real scorcher. That's why I didn't send it earlier. I am sending it anyway, just so you can see how pissed I was at the time. I am writing this cover letter to soften the previous reply and to tell you that I am somewhat intrigued by your numerous approaches. He sealed up both letters together and sent them to Garland once and for all. A few days later, Romero's home phone rang. It was Scott Miller. Romero laid into him about sending those fake fan letters, but Scott had other things on his mind. Fuck those letters, Scott said breathlessly. The only reason I did that was because I knew my only chance to get a hold of you was to go through the back door. Game companies at the time were extremely competitive and secretive, especially when it came to their programming talent. When Romero had been a young gamer, programmers like Richard Guerra or Ken and Roberta Williams always got top billing. Their names advertised in big letters on the box. But by the early 90s, times had changed. Companies were not above poaching. As a precaution, many game publishers would loom over their staff, monitoring calls to make sure that no one was trying to make a steal. Scott, well aware of the sensitivity of his call, had chosen instead to try and lure Romero into contacting him. It worked, though ironically not as originally intended. He hadn't meant to piss Romero off, but now that he had his attention, he wasn't about to let it go. We gotta talk. I saw your game, Pyramids of Egypt. It was so awesome. Can you do a few more levels of it? We can make a ton of money. What are you talking about? I want to publish your game as shareware. Shareware. Romero was familiar with the concept. It dated back to a guy named Andrew Flugelman, founding editor of PC World magazine. In 1980, Flugelman wrote a program called PC Talk and released it online with a note saying that anyone who liked the wares should feel free to send him some appreciation money. Soon enough, he had to hire a staff to count all the checks. Flugelman called the practice shareware, an experiment in economics. Over the 80s, other hackers picked up the ball, making their programs for Apples, PCs, and other computers available in the same honor code. Try it. If you like it, pay me. The payment would entitle the customer to receive technical support and updates. The Association of Shareware Professionals put the business largely domestic, between 10 and 20 million annually, even with only an estimated 10% of customers paying to register a shareware title. Forbes magazine marveled at the trend, writing in 1988 that, if this doesn't sound like a very sound way to build a business, think again. Shareware, it argued, relied not on expensive advertising, but on word of mouth, or as one practitioner put it, word of disk. Robert Wallace, a top programmer at Microsoft, turned a shareware program of his called PC Write into a multi-million-dollar empire. Most authors, however, were happy to break 6 figures and often made little more than $25,000 per year. Selling 1,000 copies of a title in 1 year was a great success. Shareware was still a radical conceit, one that, furthermore, had been used only for utility programs, like check balancing programs and word processing wares. It had never been exploited for games. What was Scott thinking? As they talked, it became clear to Romero that Scott knew exactly what he was doing. Scott, like Romero, was a lifelong gamer. The son of a NASA executive, he was a conservative-looking guy with short, dark hair. He had spent his high school days in Garland, hanging out in the computer lab during the day and at the arcade after school. He even wrote a strategy guide called shootout, sap the video games, detailing all the ways to beat the hot games of 1982, from Pac-Man to Missile Command. Scott soon took the inevitable path and started making games of his own. When it came time to distribute the games, Scott took a long, hard look at the shareware market. He liked what he saw. The fact that he could run everything himself without having to deal with retailers or publishers. So he followed suit, putting out 2 text-based games in their entirety and waiting for the cash to roll in. But the cash didn't roll. It didn't even trickle. Gamers, he realized, might be a different breed from those consumers who actually paid for utilities shareware. They were more apt simply to take what they could get for free. Scott did some research and realized he wasn't alone. Other programmers who had released games in their entirety as shareware were broke too. People may be honest, he thought, but they're also generally lazy. They need an incentive. Then he got an idea. Instead of giving away the entire game, why not give out only the first portion? Then make the player buy the rest of the game directly from him. No one had tried it before, but there was no reason it couldn't work. The games Scott was making were perfectly suited to such a plan because they were broken up into short episodes or levels of play. He could simply put out, say, 15 levels of a game, then tell players that if they sent him a check, he would send them the remaining 30. In 1986, while working for a computer consulting company, Scott self-published his first game, Kingdom of Kraus, an Indiana Jones-style adventure, as shareware, making the initial levels available through BBSs and shareware catalogs. There was no advertising, no marketing, and virtually no overhead, except for the low cost of floppy disks and Ziploc bags. Because there was no other people to pay off, Scott could price his games much lower than those retail titles, $15 to $20 as opposed to $30 or $40. For every dollar he brought in, Scott was pocketing 90 cents. By the time he contacted Romero, he had earned $150,000 by word of mouth alone. Business was so good, Scott explained, that he quit his day job to start his own shareware game publishing company called Apogee. And he was looking for other games to publish. Romero was making perfect shareware games, and he didn't even know it, Scott said. An ideal shareware game had to have a few ingredients: short action titles that were broken up into levels. Because the shareware games were being distributed over BBSs, they had to be small enough for people to download them over modems. Large, graphically intense games, like those being published by Sierra Online, were simply too big for BBS-based distribution. Games had to be small, but fun and fast. Something adrenal and arcade-style enough to hook a player into buying more. If Romero would give him Pyramids of Egypt, Scott would handle all the marketing and order processing. The guys would receive some kind of advance, plus 35% royalty rate, higher than they get from any major publisher. Romero was intrigued, but there was a problem. We can't do Pyramids of Egypt, because Softdisk owns it. He could hear the disappointment in Scott's sigh. Hey, he added, screw that game. It's crapton compared to what we're doing now. A few days later, Scott received a package with the Super Mario Bros. 3 demo from Ideas from the Deep. When he fired up the game, he was knocked out. It looked just like the console version. Smooth scrolling and everything. He grabbed the phone and talked to Carmack for hours. This guy is a genius, Scott thought. He's outthinking everybody. By the time they were through talking, Scott was more than ready to make a deal. The gamers said they would use this new technology to create a title specifically for Apogee to release as shareware. Great, Scott said. Let's do it. Now they just had to come up with a game. After their initial conversation, Romero asked Scott to show them his seriousness by sending them an advance. Scott responded with a check for $2,000, half his savings. There was only one thing he wanted in return: a game by Christmas, 2 months away. Romero, Carmack, Adrian, Lane, Tom, and Jay convened in the Gamer's Edge office to come up with the game. Tom was quick to point out that because they were using this console-style technology, they should make a console-style game. Something like Mario, but different. Fueled by the energy, he was quick to volunteer himself with a fair amount of the bravado that was becoming a requisite part of their clan. "Come on, what theme do you want?" Tom said. "Tell me, I can do anything. How about science fiction?" They liked the idea. "Why don't we do something," Carmack said, "where a little kid genius saves the world or something like that, "Okay, yeah," Tom said. "I have a great idea for something like that." And in a blur, he sped from the room and locked himself in the office, in the Apple II department. He could feel his head opening up, the ideas pouring out in what sounded like the voice of Walter Winchell. Tom had long been a huge fan of Warner Brothers cartoons. Chuck Jones, the Looney Tunes animator, was a god to him. He'd also watched Dan Aykroyd's impression of the Untouchables, Elliot Ness as a kid. He thought about all these things, plus Mario, plus, for flavor, a routine by the comedian George Carlin, about people who use bay leaves as underarm deodorant and go around smelling like bean with bacon soup. Tom typed until he had 3 paragraphs on his paper. Pulling it out of the printer, he dashed back into the Gamer's Edge office and read these words in his best Winchell impression. "Billy Blaze, 8-year-old genius, works diligently in his backyard clubhouse. Has created an interstellar spaceship from old soup cans, rubber cement, and plastic tubing. While his folks are out of town and the babysitter asleep, Billy sneaks out to his backyard workshop, dons his brother's football helmet, and transforms into Commander Keen, defender of justice. In his ship, the Bean with Bacon mega rocket, Keen dispenses justice with an iron hand. In this episode, aliens from the planet Vorticon 6 find out about the 8-year-old genius and plan his destruction. While Keen is out exploring the mountains of Mars, the Vorticons steal his ship and leave pieces of it around the galaxy. Can Keen recover all the pieces of his ship and repel the Vorticon invasion? Will he make it back before his parents get home? Stay tuned." He looked around. Silence. Then in a burst, everyone was laughing, even the generally stoic John Carmack, who not only laughed, but applauded. Commander Keen was on board. Where he would take them, they hardly knew. The gamers weren't just soft disk guys anymore. They were, as they called themselves, the IFD guys, co-owners of ideas from the deep. Soft disk, as a result, took on an even greater power. But it was a day job, a job they all needed, since there was no real money coming in yet, and no guarantee that would come in at all. They decided, then, to continue working on titles for Gamer's Edge during the day while they churned out Commander Keen from the lake house at night. They became all the more efficient at borrowing the soft disk computers. Every night after work, they'd back their cars up to the office and load the machines. The next morning, they'd come in early enough to bring the computers back. They even got a little cocky about it. Though the machines were top of the line, they wanted some minor adjustments made. Jay began moseying on down to the soft disk administration office to request new parts. Al Vacuvius took notice of the request, but didn't think too much of them. He was still gung-ho about Gamer's Edge and the potential to break into the PC marketplace. So whatever the gamers wanted, the gamers would have. From October to December 1990, they worked virtually non-stop to get Keen done for Scott by Christmas. And it wasn't just one Keen. It was a trilogy called Invasion of the Vorticons. Trilogies were common in the games industry for the same reason they were common in books and films. They were the best way to build and expand a brand identity. Tom, who assumed the role of creative director, mapped out the game plan. Mario, this was not. As a hero, an 8-year-old misfit who steals his dad's Everclear for rocket fuel was more identifiable than a middle-aged Italian plumber. It was as if the gamers had followed the golden rule of writing about what they knew. Tom, as a kid, used to walk around in Green Bay Packers helmet and red Converse sneakers, just like Billy Blaze. And in a sense, they were all Billy Blazes, oddball kids who modify technology to create elaborate means of escape. Keen was a punk, a hacker, and he was saving the galaxy, just as countless hackers like Carmack and Romero used technology to save themselves. The roles were set. Carmack and Romero were the programmers, and Tom the lead designer, the person in charge of coming up with the game plan elements. From the story and setting to the characters and weapons, Carmack and Romero were happy to leave Tom to the creative work. They were too busy programming. Carmack was refining his engine, getting his smooth scrolling down to the point where Keen could move as fluid left or right as he could up or down. Romero, meanwhile, was working the editor, the program that allows the developers to put together the graphics of the game. Characters, rooms, monsters. It was essentially a game designer's construction kit. Carmack and Romero were in sync. Not everyone else gelled quite as well. Lane was now officially kicked out of Keen development. Despite Romero's fondness for him as a friend, he felt that Lane's energy was lacking. Adrian was having problems of his own. Though he was recruited later to help them work on Keen, Adrian hated the project. It was too cutesy. Tom had a target audience in mind. Kids, he said, or those who had a kid-like mentality like we do. Adrian hated kiddie stuff. Even more, he hated cutesy. Worst of all was cutesy Kitty, and now here he was having to sit all night drawing pizza slices, soda pop, and candy. Tom came up with a little character called a Yorp with a big fat green body and one periscope-like eye over his head. Even the monsters were cute. In most games, when a character died, it would simply disappear, vanish. But Tom had other notions. He was eager to incorporate some larger, philosophical ideas, as he said. He loosely based game characters on ideas he'd read in Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. A guard was made to represent an ID. He wanted to teach kids that when people or even aliens die, they really die. They leave corpses. So he wanted the dead creatures in the game to just remain. Not graphic or bloody corpses, just dead Yorps. Cute, dead Yorps. The cuteness of the characters wasn't the only thing bugging Adrian. It was the cuteness of the creator. Tom was getting on his nerves. He would run around the house, craning his neck and making sounds to show Adrian exactly what the alien creatures in the games were supposed to look like. Romero would usually crack up at these displays. Adrian took a liking to Romero, who shared his taste in heavy metal and his appreciation of sick humor. But Tom, in Adrian's mind, was just plain annoying. To make matters worse, they had to share a desk. And Tom was so full of energy that he kept bobbing his knee up and down, inadvertently hitting the table when Adrian was trying to draw. But it was better than working at the last open space in the house, next to the litter box used for John Carmack's cat, Mitzi. Tom had no idea how Adrian felt. He thought he was just quiet. For the majority of the time, however, those late nights at the lake house were a perpetual programming party, with Iggy Pop or Dawkins playing on the stereo. The guys all worked into the wee hours. Occasionally, they'd take a break to play Super Mario on the Nintendo, or maybe a round of Dungeons and Dragons. Carmack had been building a large D&D campaign for the guys, and on Saturday nights, they'd gather around a table and play into the early morning hours. With Carmack as Dungeon Master, the game took on depth and complexity. It was becoming the longest and deepest D&D game he'd ever created, and there were no signs of it letting up. Other times, they'd cruise the lake on the boat. Jay quickly became the designated driver. His impeccable focus gave him the ability to drive not only fast, but steady. A couple times they let Romero drive, but he was having too much fun, steering the boat precipitously off course. Jay also felt comfortable into the role of manager, or in a sense, frat house president. While the guys worked, he would grill up ribs on the barbecue or restock the sodas. They were under the gun and needed all the help they could get. They didn't need any help getting motivated, however. Carmack, in particular, seemed almost inhumanly immune to distraction. One time, Jay tested Carmack's resolve by popping a porno video into the VCR and cranking it to full volume. Romero and the others immediately heard the oohs and ahs and turned around cracking up. Carmack, though, stayed glued to his monitor. Only after a minute or so did he acknowledge the increasingly active groans. His sole response was, Then he returned to the work at hand. Back at Softdisk, Al Vacuvius was beginning to grow suspicious of his star gamers. Jay was continually requesting parts for the computer, and the other guys were behaving more curtly and elusively. His first suspicion came shortly after they were working on their new game for Softdisk, a Ninja Warrior title called Shadow Knights. Al had never seen a side-scrolling like this for the PC. "Wow," he told Carmack. "You should patent this technology." Carmack turned red. "If you ever ask me to patent anything," he snapped, "I'll quit." Al assumed Carmack was trying to protect his own financial interests, but in reality, he had struck what was growing into an increasingly raw nerve for the young, idealistic programmer. It was one of the few things that could truly make him angry. It was ingrained in his bones since his first reading of the hacker ethic. All of the science and technology and culture and learning and academics is built upon using the work that others have done before, Carmack thought. But to take a patenting approach and say it's like, well, this is my idea, you cannot extend this idea in any way because I own this idea. It just seems so fundamentally wrong. Patents were jeopardizing the very thing that was central to his life: writing code to solve problems. If the world became a place in which he couldn't solve a problem without infringing on someone's patents, he would be very unhappy living there. Carmack was becoming more blunt and insulting about other topics as well, most notably the rest of the Softdisk staff. "You've got a lot of terrible programmers here," he said. "They just stink." It was as if Carmack simply didn't care how he alienated himself from the rest of the employees. Al began dropping by the Gamer's Edge office more often, only to discover more strange behavior. He once walked in to find Carmack, Romero, and Tom huddled around Romero's computer, with their backs to the door. When Al made his presence known, they quickly dispersed. He stepped over and asked them what was going on. "Nothing but dirty jokes, Al," Romero replied, gingerly. When Al looked at the screen, it was suspiciously blank. Later, he commented to Carmack that Romero was acting strangely, which struck Al as odd since Romero was always so nice. Carmack considered this momentarily, then, as always, blurted out his unedited perception of the truth. "Romero was just being friendly," Carmack said. "When you turn your back, he hates your guts." By Thanksgiving, the guys were immersed in the death schedule back at the lake house. Sleep was not an issue. Neither was showering. Eating was something they essentially had to remind themselves to do. To help keep them fed while they crunched on Keen, Scott had begun sending the team weekly $100 checks labeled Pizza Bonus, playing off the pepperoni slice icon that appeared in Keen. Pizza was id's fuel. It was, as Carmack enjoyed noting, the perfect invention: hot, quick, and containing a variety of food groups. When Jay opened an envelope from Scott and waved the check in the air, everyone would declare, "Pizza money!" Scott was confident he'd see a return on his investment. He had initiated a full-on blitz. Because of his own success, he had built strong ties with the heads of various BBSs and shareware magazines across the country. He called every one of them, preparing each for a game that would revolutionize the industry. Before long, whenever people logged on to a BBS, they would see a title screen reading, "Coming soon from Apogee, Commander Keen." Scott was putting his reputation on the line, but there was never a doubt in the gamer's mind that Keen would deliver. Tom was in overdrive on the design, bouncing ideas like ping-pong balls off Romero. If Romero doubled over laughing, he knew he was on the right track. Scott offered his own advice for the game. "One of the reasons for Mario Brothers' popularity," he wrote them in a letter, "is that you can continue playing the game in search of secret or hidden bonuses, etc. I would really like to see something like this implemented in Clean. It would really add to the game, I think." "Like, duh," the guys responded. They loved finding secrets in games. Already, secrets were like a subculture among programmers. Sometimes there were secret levels, or inside jokes, or tricks that had no real bearing on the outcome of the game. These were called Easter eggs. The mother of all eggs occurred in 1980, when intrepid Atari 2600 geeks stumbled on a secret room in the geometric role-playing game Adventure, only to find the flashing words, Warren Robinette. Some players haplessly shot at the name, others just scratched their heads. Robinette was a disgruntled adventure programmer who wanted recognition following a corporate takeover. Tom came up with some tricks for Keen. In Episode 1, players could find a secret hidden city if they pulled a combination of moves, like throwing themselves in the line of fire of an ice cannon. Around the game, he inserted cryptic signs written in what was supposed to be Vorticon alphabet. If the players stumbled into a secret area, they could get the translations. The guys were so enthusiastic that they decided to put in a preview of their upcoming games, which at the time didn't exist. They described more installments of Keen, as well as a new game based on characters and elements of Carmack's evolving Dungeons & Dragons world. The Fight for Justice, they wrote, a completely new approach to fantasy gaming. You start not as a weakling with no food, you start as Quake, the strongest, most dangerous person on the continent. You start off with a hammer of thunderbolts, the ring of regeneration, and a trans-dimensional artifact. All the people you meet will have their own personalities, lives, and objectives. The Fight for Justice will be the finest PC game yet. The lake house was filled with the same sense of unlimited possibilities, and the bond between Carmack and Romero was becoming stronger by the day. It was like two tennis players who, after years of destroying their competition, finally had a chance to play equals. Romero pushed Carmack to be a better programmer. Carmack pushed Romero to be a better designer. What they shared equally was their passion. This was the most clear to Carmack on one late weekend night. He was sitting in the house working at his PC as lightning flashed outside. Mitzi curled lazily on the top of his monitor, her legs draping over the screen. The heat of her body was causing Carmack's heat-sensitive display to ooze its colors. He pushed Mitzi gently from the monitor, and she scurried away with a hiss. A rainstorm had picked up, and it was mighty. Cross Lake spilled into the backyard like the prelude to a horror movie. The lake was so high that it pushed a ski boat to the top of the boathouse. Long, black water moccasins slithered toward the deck. The bridge leading to Lakeshore Drive was completely washed out. When Jay arrived after having been out for the day, there was no way to get in. It was, as he described it, a turd floater of a storm, bringing everything from the bottom of the lake to the surface. He turned away to wait it out. Romero arrived with a friend later to find the bridge even worse than when Jay got there. There was simply no way he was going to get his car over the flooded expanse, and there were probably alligators and moccasins now making it their home. Back in the house, Carmack resigned himself to working on his own that night. After all these hours, he had come to appreciate Romero's diverse range of talents, gleaned from years of making his own Apple II games. Romero had been not only a coder, but an artist, a designer, and a businessman. On top of all that, he was fun. Romero didn't just love games. In a sense, he was a game. A walking, talking, beeping, twitching human video game who never seemed to let anything get him down. Like a game character, he could always find an extra life. Just then, the door behind Carmack swung open. Mitzi dashed under his feet. Carmack turned to see Romero standing there with his big, thick glasses, soaking wet up to his chest. Lightning flashing behind him, a big smile on his face. It was a real moment, a moment so impressive that Carmack actually saved it in his thin file of sentimental memories. This one he wanted for future access. The night Romero waded through a stormy river to work. On the afternoon of December 14th, 1990, Scott Miller pressed a button on his PC and uploaded the Commander Keen shareware episode Marooned on Mars to the first BBS. For $30, players could purchase the other two episodes, which Scott would ship on floppy disks and Ziploc bags. Before Keen, Scott's total shareware sales were about 7,000 per month. By Christmas, Keen was approaching 30,000. The game was, as Scott told the numerous editors and BBS controllers who were deluging him with calls, a little atom bomb. No one had ever seen anything like it for the PC. The humor, the graphics, the side-scrolling Mario-type action. Superlative alert! heralded one reviewer. Be prepared to hear praise like we have rarely heaped on any program. Keen sets a new standard for shareware games, declared another. For stimulating, velvet smooth, and cutting-edge PC arcade action, wrote a third. There is nothing better than Commander Keen from Apogee Software. Nothing. The game wasn't just on par with Nintendo, it concluded. It was better. Fans couldn't agree more. They were deluging Apogee with letters of praise and letters inquiring about the next games in the Keen series. All the main BBSs were ablaze with conversation about Keen, tricks, secrets, and strategies. Gamers were pleading for information to code the Vorticon alphabet. Scott was so swamped that he recruited his mother and his first employee, a teenage programmer named Sean Green, to help with the demand. When Sean showed up for work the first morning, he was greeted by Scott's mother, standing in her bathrobe holding 2 cordless phones. The second she handed him one, it started to ring. Romero, Carmack, and the rest of the group celebrated with a huge party at the lake house on New Year's Eve. The stereo cranked Prince. The grill smoked. Revelers boated around the lake. Romero, who rarely drank, made this night a special occasion. It had been a great year, but a tough year, one that had cost him his wife and kids. Faced with the choice, he'd chosen the game life over his family life. Though he spoke frequently with the boys and saw them as often as he could, he was living with a new family now, the Gamers, and he wanted this night together to last. He, Tom, and Jay were drunk on white wine and champagne in the kitchen. Romero saw Carmack standing in the corner by himself, sober. "Come on, Carmack," he slurred. "You gotta drink. Don't be a baby. It's going to be 1991. Normally in these situations, Carmack wanted nothing less than to disappear into the wallpaper. This kind of scene, socializing, cavorting, was never his domain. He would rather be reading or programming. But contrary to what the other guys might have thought, he wasn't inhuman. He was fun-loving too, just in his own way. He was thrilled to be working for himself, making games, collaborating with people he admired and respected. It took only a little coaxing from Romero to get Carmack to join them in downing several glasses of champagne. The strongest thing they'd seen him drink before was Diet Coke. Sometime later, Romero found Carmack leaning quietly against the kitchen wall. "Hey man," Romero said, "you feeling buzzed yet? You getting drunk, Carmack?" "I am losing control of my faculties," Carmack replied. Then he stumbled away. Romero got a lot of mileage out of that response, repeating it robotically to everyone throughout the night. It was good to see Carmack loosen up. 2 weeks later, Jay walked out to the mailbox and came back brandishing an envelope. It was the first residual check from Apogee. "Pizza money," they all said as he opened it up. The check was for $10,500. With barely any overhead expenses, it was gravy. At this rate, they'd be making more than $100,000 in their first year. More than enough for them to quit their day jobs at Softdisk. Alva Cuvius still had no idea that they were moonlighting on the Keen games, let alone doing it on the company computers. Gamer's Edge was doing quite well, and their latest games, Catacomb 2 and Shadow Knights, were drawing raves. Softdisk had about 3,000 subscribers who had paid $69.95 per year to receive Gamer's Edge every month. They knew he was counting on them and weren't sure how he'd react to their mass departure. Carmack and Romero made it clear that they didn't care. This was their break, after all. Tom, by contrast, was nervous about the move. He was worried about getting sued by Softdisk, ruining their chances not only for making it on their own, but for enjoying the fruits of Keen's successes. Romero scoffed at his worries. "Dude, what's Al going to do if he sues you? You don't have anything for him to get. All you have is a piece of shit couch," he said, pointing to the broken sofa in the living room. "I mean, what the fuck? What are you worried about losing?" Jay also expressed concern, urging the guys to handle this delicately with their boss. "Don't drop a bomb on him," he implored. "Don't worry," Romero said with his characteristic optimism. "Everything's going to be fine." However, Al's suspicions began to mount when an employee mentioned something about the Gamer's Edge guys moonlighting on their own games. Al confronted Carmack, who he knew had a tough, if not impossible time telling lies. It was like feeding questions into a computer or adding numbers on a calculator. The answers always came out right. "I admit it," Carmack said. "We've been using your computers. We've been writing our own games on your time." Later, he and Romero broke the news. They were going to leave, and they were taking Adrian, Carmack, their art intern, with them. Al felt like he'd walk into his house to find that someone had broken his windows and stolen his television. But he didn't let himself get too far down. Immediately, he tried to turn the situation around. "Look," he said, "let's try to salvage something out of this. Let's go into business together. Let's form a new company. I'll support you, and you guys write whatever games you want, and I'll handle selling them. We'll split everything 50-50, and I won't take any legal action against you." The offer caught them by surprise. They had assumed Big Al was going to sue them, not finance their business. Now there was a new golden opportunity. All they wanted to do was have their own business, and they had no interest in dealing with the hassles of taxes and distribution. If Al was going to handle that stuff, what the hell? They agreed. But when Al returned to the Softdisk office, he walked into a mutiny. The entire company had gathered to demand an explanation. Carmack and Romero had come back from lunch and bragged about some big special deal they were getting, one of the employees said. "What's the deal? Here these jokers had cheated the company, used the company computers, and now you're giving them half of a new company? Why are you rewarding them?" "Because it's good business," Al said. "Because these guys are good. They're going to make money for the company. We'll all be successful." No one was buying it. Either the gamers go, they said, or all 30 of them were going to quit. Al sighed deeply and walked back to the Gamer's Edge office. "You guys went and told everyone about this and created a nightmare," he said. "Do you realize what you have done?" "Well," Carmack replied, "we wanted to be truthful." "Yeah, but I could have positioned it a lot better," he said. "I can't afford to lose my staff. The deal's off." After several weeks of negotiations and threatened lawsuits, it was agreed that they would contract with Softdisk to write one new game for Gamer's Edge every 2 months. It was demoralizing, not only for the Softdisk staff, but for Al. He saw that, despite their talent, the Gamer's Edge guys really were just boys living by their own rules, and cheating when necessary. Worst of all, they had no sense of guilt. For them, it was something to laugh about. They never considered the people who worked at Softdisk. Before Carmack left, Al pulled him aside and asked, "Did you ever think about the people who'd have worked so hard and supported you?" Carmack listened, but Al's words didn't compute. He was looking into the face of the past, of opportunities unrealized, of all the old authority figures who had ever stood in his way. As always, he was blunt to a fault. "I don't care about them," Al would recall Carmack replying. "I'll go back to making pizzas before I stay at this crummy place." On February 1st, 1991, id Software was born.